Okay, before we leave the Ascomycota, there are a couple of scientific names and a couple of things you need to know about them. So, yeast is the only single celled of the Ascomycota, and they're going to reproduce asexually through budding. And like I said before, budding is just where a bud, like a pimple, buds off of the parent and then it falls off and becomes a new yeast. So they're a little bit different. The scientific name Saccharomyces cerevisiae, this is a scientific name for baker's yeast. Anytime you buy yeast at the grocery store, what causes bread to rise, they use it for baking. They use it in winemaking and brewing of beer. Another famous ascomycete is Penicillium notatum. Now, this is a scientific name for the antibiotic penicillin. And when Alexander Fleming um, had his petri dishes and he saw that green stuff growing, this is the fungus that was growing. It's also the fungus that you see growing on old moldy oranges. However, don't think that you can eat an orange and get the source of penicillin because it did take them about 10 years to perfect that fungus into an antibiotic. All right, truffles. Many of you may have had some truffles. This is the fruiting body of a subterranean. That means below ground. And so in Italy, very often they have truffle farms, and you can't plant truffles, and that's what makes them very expensive. And they're very, very hard to find. They will have like truffle rooting pigs, pigs that can actually smell the truffles below the ground and root them out. And sometimes they're hundreds and hundreds of dollars by the time you take them to market because it's not something you can plant. It's just something that grows below ground and it's, not anything you can prepare for. Apparently, and I've only tasted one kind, and there's all kinds of truffles. It has a very musky odor. The one I tasted was very bitter, but some are very garlicky. So yeast, penicillium, and truffles all come from this phylum. All right, moving on to Basidiomycota. These are our mushrooms. This is what we typically think of when we think of a fungus. Most of them are multicellular, they're terrestrial, they're living on land. They can be saprophytic, they can be breaking down organic material, they can live as parasites. Some of them have a symbiotic relationship that is mutual. One thing about our club fungi is that they are the largest. You're not going to see any single celled club fungi, and they call them club because they think the stalks of the mushrooms look like little bats. I don't really get that, but that's where they get their name. And they only reproduce sexually, so they're not going to have any asexual life cycle to their life cycle. All right, Basidiomycota reproduces only sexually, and the fruiting body now is called the Basiliocarp. I'm going to show you a picture in just a minute. The Basiliocarp is the above ground structure. It's the fruiting body. It's what when we look at a mushroom, that's what we're looking at is the Basiliocarp. And on the underside of the cap, typically the mushroom is made of a cap, a stalk, which is called a stipe, and then you have the hyphae. Well, if you look on the underside of the cap, you can see what look like gills. And in the gills, there's a structure called a basidium. And the basidium holds the spores, and they're called basidiospores. The basidiospores are going to be dispersed through the wind. The wind is going to blow. They're going to land on moist terrain, and they're going to grow a new mushroom. And some of the mycelium for these mushrooms can stretch a long way. There's some in Oregon that stretch, they say 3 and 4 football fields long. So you actually could knock down the mushroom portion and it could produce all kinds of new fruiting bodies along this mycelium. So some of them are quite large. And and they can, go forever. The one in Oregon, I think, is the largest and it's protected. All right, here's the structure. And so I just wanted to show you this because here's your typical cap. These are the gills. This little white tissue here is called an annulus. Here is your stalk, and then you can see your hyphae here, the individual threads, and they form this great, big, huge mycelium. They do have septate hyphae. If you look, you can see that there are cross walls with the pores in between. So the basidia are underneath in all of these gills, and the wind is going to blow, and it's going to blow the spores onto the ground, and then you're going to get a new mushroom. Typically, these mushrooms in the spring form what are called fairy rings, and what happens is the spores land, and they tend to land in a circle, and so folklore has it that fairies would jump from cap to cap. But if you hear the term fairy ring, that's what they're talking about. So wind is the most common form of dispersal for your mushroom. Now here is the life cycle, and if you take your mushroom here, we're starting down here with your mushroom, you can see the basidia is on the gills, the spores are produced in the basidia, and then they're going to blow. And because each spore is actually has two nuclei, all the nuclei have to do is join, and then through meiosis they're going to form opposite mating types, and then you have got a new hyphae. So they have a very, very simple life cycle. All right, there are some that you need to know. Agaricus bisporus is your common everyday grocery store mushroom. This is the kind that we tend to put on our salads and are edible. Amanita phalloides is called the death angel. The death angel releases a toxin. All of the Amanita genus are toxic, but this death angel releases a toxin called an amatoxin. And what it does is it causes intense intestinal distress, and then within hours, I think they said within 12 hours, it destroys all kidney and liver function and causes kidney and liver failure. So, it's very common for these amanita that if you look them up on the internet, they look just like, normal mushrooms that we see in the grocery store. So mycologists are the people who study fungus. If you're going to study fungus, you're a mycologist, and they're really the only ones that can visually look at a mushroom and tell whether it's poisonous or not. So be mindful of that because not all mushrooms are edible. The largest of our edible mushroom is the portobello mushroom, and this is a genus because there's so many different species, and they're very tasty. I'm sure that you've probably had them, but they're the very large mushrooms in the grocery store that are really good for grilling and eating. So they have a lot of nutrients in them, guys. Mushrooms are really, really nutritious and have a lot of selenium and magnesium and trace elements that we need. I know that some of you probably don't like them. Some of you probably love them. I'd love them. But there's all kinds, and they all belong to our typical mushroom, belongs to Basidiomycota. It has more species in this phylum and is also the largest in size. So some of these mushrooms can get to be quite large.